Hi, it's really strange to be talking into a camera, but it's wonderful to have this opportunity to join in these events that you are organizing at the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. And for years I've been just looking through emails and seeing your program, and it's everything you do seems so related to my interests, and so I'm really thrilled to be part of this research seminar, and even if it's from afar, remotely. And I am in Madrid. I'm joining you from the most strict and severe lockdown that I could have ever imagined. And I've been in this lockdown for 6 weeks. I was teaching a course in Barcelona on Spanish women in the 20th century, and that the center where I was teaching closed, and I had to come to Madrid suddenly. All my things are still in Barcelona, my books and other possessions, so I have had to put this talk together with what I have with me, and I hope that will work out. But I don't have all the materials that I would have liked to have handy. So hopefully my memory is not failing after all this lockdown, and I have enough references on my computer and on paper to keep this to make this interesting and keep it going. So I did want to mention that I watched and I was really interested by last week's discussion, by Hanny Lawler's discussion on responses to trauma and relationality in Spanish and French women's work, and her focus on Milena Busquets. I thought that was very interesting. A lot of the questions she raises are questions that come up in my own work, and I really just thought that she gave a wonderfully eloquent and condensed presentation of some of these issues that that really explore the limits or the limitlessness of life writing, and whether life writing can make room for voices of missing subjects. And I now need to turn to my own subject, because I'm not going to just reiterate different excellent points that Hanny made, but I did just want to say how impressed I am by her work and how relevant it is. I have written 2 biographies, one of Constancia de la Mora, who was a very important figure during the Spanish Civil War. She was the head of the Foreign Press Office during the war, and as some of you who may be interested in Spain and its history may know, the foreign press and the war of words, or the propaganda war surrounding what was happening in Spain, was almost as important as the battle on the ground and in the skies, and as the military battles. So I think that Constancia de la Mora's role was really singular. She was dealing with all the foreign correspondents. She spoke English, she spoke French, and so she was the head of the Republican Foreign Press Office, and so it was very important for her to get the Republic's story told, especially in the English and the North American press, and to have their point of view shared. And she really was a woman who rose to great prominence during the Civil War, and the Civil War, was a a terrible tragedy for Spain that lasted nearly 3 years and left very tragic consequences in its wake. But at the same time, the war presented a new and unanticipated landscape for women to take action and to be involved in ways that they had never been before in Spanish life. And so Constancia de la Mora's life is a very good example of this. And sadly, when the war ended, she and her side had lost and the Franco side had won. She was stranded in the United States, and she ended up living in Mexico in exile, and she died when she was quite young in a car crash in Guatemala. And her life after the war was difficult, as it was for so many of the thousands of Spanish Republican exiles. And so this was my first biography, and to get to kind of relate this back to the title of this talk, the elusive subject, exile and biography. In her case, when I started writing this book about her, I was just completely stumped as to where to look for materials about her. She had written an autobiography called In Place of Splendor, which was about the war and about her experience in the war. And this was a fascinating point of departure, and obviously put her on the map and kind of turned her into a subject. However, this book was also problematic for me as a scholar, because it left so much out, and it was published in 1939, years before she died, and so there was just so much missing around this book. And so this book was an interesting point of departure, but it left so many gaps in terms of her life. And her family in Spain had last seen her in 1936 or 37 at the latest. So in the 2000s, they were not, really in a great position to help me reconstruct her life and her death. She had died somewhere else, and they hadn't seen her for many decades. And her family in Mexico was dispersed, and her grandchildren, great-grandchildren, were also very distant from her chronologically and in every way. She had a daughter who had not grown up with her, and her daughter had passed away by the time I started working on this book. So there was just very little to go on. And I think that something that I learned from writing this biography was that as a biographer, one has to be very creative, especially when one's subject doesn't have an archive. It's wonderful. I've obviously also done research in many libraries about people and about literary works where there's a lot of material. I was recently in the Houghton Library at Harvard, and the archives there are fantastic. If you want to write a biography of Trotsky, they have everything you need down in the basement, temperature controlled, file after file, box after box. All of Trotsky's papers are there. If you want to write a biography of John Updike, every single letter he ever wrote to his parents is at this library in Harvard. So that's a great thing that these libraries and these archives exist. However, when one's writing about people who are exiles, it's not always the case. It's like in the case of Trotsky, with Constancia de la Mora, a lesser known person, a woman, she just kind of, poof, went into thin air in exile, and there were no documents or letters or photographs in one collection. So in terms of researching the life of lesser known people who end up in exile and who die in exile and who don't have a kind of, family or team or national government or local government or local cultural organization behind them and preserving their legacy, it's really up to the biographer to piece together little tiny fragments of legacy that may come from somebody else's files in an archive, somebody who knew, the target person, in this case Constancia, or a distant cousin, or the daughter of an old friend. So I think that's something at this, on the one hand, writing her biography was very challenging because there wasn't, just this kind of material that you had to plow through, which must be incredibly difficult. I think of Robert Caro and his multi-volume biographies of Lyndon B. Johnson, and how, what an unsurmountable task to plow through all those materials and to write that many volume biography. And at the same time, I think when I was writing the biography of Constancia, I was a little jealous of somebody who had, masses of information at their fingertips and had that daunting task of plowing through it. This was more the daunting task of trying to make stone soup, just something out of nothing, and trying to find little tiny nuggets that could lead from A to B and allow me to construct some kind of story about her life that, long before the Civil War, that a life that started really with her grandparents and her upbringing and why she became politically active and radicalized in the 1930s, how her personal life and Spanish politics and her desire to be a free woman and to be engaged and to kind of shatter all the expectations of her society and her family and become an ambitious and very capable woman. How did all this come about? So I think that in writing her biography, I learned a lot about people's lives and life writing, and especially because I was always relating back to her own version of her life in Place of Splendor, the one thing I had to go on. And this book, it turns out, this is something I discovered while doing research for the biography, she didn't even write her book. It was ghostwritten, and she had told it to an American writer, and it was used as a political platform to gain sympathy for the Spanish Republic. So even that book, which was the one source I had for Constancia, and which I thought was her unfiltered, her telling her life story, I had to question almost everything she said, because I had to be honest with myself and my readers and make clear that this very beautifully written book had not been written by her, but by this very successful author, Ruth McKenney, and that it was all filtered through a political moment and a political cause, and therefore, all this had to be taken into account. And so I spent about 4 or 5 years doing the research for this book, not continuously. It was off and on, in the summers and during my leaves and during holidays, and ultimately tracking down dozens of people who's had a father who had known Constancia, or whose grandfather or grandmother had known her in Mexico or in Spain. and other people who had written about her in unpublished manuscripts, and just a couple in published sources. And so this book was, I think this project was a really important project for me to cut my teeth as a biographer, working on an elusive subject, on a subject who had left, rebelled against her home, her home country, her kind of national identity. She had not stayed in her place, and thus was very, very difficult to track down as a biographical subject. So that book is out and it's published, and I don't think it's really important to tell you any more about it. It's published in English and in Spanish, and I hope that if you care to track it down, that you will be able to find it at a university library or online, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about that book. My second biography took about 6 or 7 years. It's the biography of Jorge Simple. Jorge Simbroom was a much better known figure than Constancia, and he was a writer. He wrote many novels. His genre was very much autofiction, and so a very juicy subject in terms of life writing and memory and autobiography. And he just had also a very action-packed life. His family went into exile to France from Spain when he was about 13, and they had a peripatetic existence. They left everything behind in Spain. So again, finding materials from his childhood, photographs of his family, impossible. He during his whole life in exile, he only had one photograph of his mother that was saved from when they left Spain. And when he was 18, he was in France as a Spanish exile. He joined the French resistance, and after a couple of months he was arrested and deported to a Nazi camp, to Buchenwald, and he was there for about 18 months. He survived. He was liberated by the Americans when they liberated the camp, and he became very radicalized because of the experience. He also became a communist, and he worked first within the French Communist Party and then within the Spanish Communist Party, trying to do underground work against Franco and all this from France. And eventually he started traveling, making clandestine trips to Spain to try to mobilize Spanish youth from within the universities and also Spanish cultural sectors, film and publishing, against Franco. The Spanish Communist Party during the Franco era has a very complicated history, and I will just kind of sum up what was really relevant to him, which was that after 12 years of risking his life and committing himself to the Spanish Communist Party, which he saw as Spain's only hope to lead Spain into a democracy, not into a communist regime, but to free Spain from fascism and become a new republic. After 12 years of working with this party, he realized that the party leaders really had very different goals and that he was not at all in agreement with. And he broke with the Spanish Communist Party after this long investment and stayed in Paris and became a writer. And his first book was the Long Voyage, the Long Voyage, or El Largo Viaje. And this was kind of a breakout bestseller book. It won the Premio Formentor, and which was a very important prize at the time, which came with a hefty prize money award. And he beat out Mario Vargas Llosa's La Ciudad de los Perros, and so it was really kind of a big deal. He had a tremendous debut as an author, and he went on to write about over a dozen books, screenplays, and he was nominated for 2 Oscars. He worked with Costa Gavras, he worked with Alain René, and he not only wrote screenplays and collaborated with these very important filmmakers in France, but he also directed his own film called Les Deux Mémoires, the 2 memories, or Las Dos Memorias, and it's a fascinating documentary about Spain and the memory of the Civil War. And he filmed this in France at a castle that he borrowed. Hello, I am going to continue. I was talking about Jorge Simbroom and his documentary Les Deux Mémoires, and at that point my video was no longer recording. So I'm going to go back to where I was, and hopefully somehow this will be seamlessly spliced together with the first part of my talk. So the part that was lost, and which I will now try to recreate, was that Jorge Simple was somebody who was much better known than Constancia de la Mora, and there was, even though his siblings had passed away and he had passed away, by the time I started working on him, there was more material. There was so much more in the press about him because he was well known. There were people I could talk to who knew him, and I would say that the biggest challenge I faced in working on him was that he had kind of auto-generated and self-curated this image of himself that dovetailed very nicely with the image that his family and that the French press and the French cultural world wanted to have of him. This image was of a hero, of a war hero, of a survivor, somebody who had been in the French resistance, who had been an anti-fascist, who had survived a concentration camp, and who had written all these wonderful books. He was, just an ideal hero for France, for Europe, for Spain, sometimes because he had a complicated relationship with Spain. And so what I had said before in my video that I thought was recording, and I will probably try to say more briefly now, is that a hero is kind of an impenetrable surface for a biographer to try and work with. Subjects are human beings, biographers are human beings. So how can we, there's no way to work with the hero and preserve that image unless we are just writing a PR piece about that person. So in writing about Jorge Simbroom and in reading his work and studying his life, there were so many questions that came up. And I think that in this sense, it was very similar to what happened with Constancia de la Mora, that there were just so many questions that I wanted to know the answers to. Yes, he was in the French resistance, and I was not questioning, the fact that he was in the French resistance, but I really wanted to know why he had joined up, and why he had done all these things that in his version of events it was always just the right thing to do or the noble thing to do. But I wondered if there weren't, more layers to that, and personal reasons and a personal life that had really shaped him, and that what his experiences in exile had been, how his mother's death when he was a very young boy had shaped him, how being one of 7 siblings in exile at a time, leaving the Spanish Civil War, geographically leaving Spain for France, and almost running right into World War II, with a father who could not afford to keep 7 children afloat. How did all this affect him? How did it affect his ambitions, his desires, his worldview? And so I think that the Jorge Simbroom that I discovered in my biography is not a Jorge Simbroom who matches up to the 100% hero, moral hero, kind of very macho hero that other people might be familiar with. And I think that just to, this book, my biography of Jorge Simple, is a pretty extensive book. I spent many years working on it. It's available in 3 languages. So I hope that if you're interested in tracking it down, you will, and you can find it in French, English, or Spanish. It's available on Kindle. And if you want to ask me any questions about it, I'd be happy to answer them. But I think that what's important as a biographer, and especially in the context of this life writing seminar, is, or what I think is important and would like to leave you with, and hopefully something that we can discuss, is that by making somebody more complex than their image is, and I'm sure that this is something you've talked a lot about, because I know that a lot of people have talked about the difficulty of working on celebrities or famous people. And Jorge Simple was and is a very famous person in France, in Germany, and in Spain. He was Minister of Culture with Felipe González. So you have this person who has, whose celebrity and whose heroic image is almost a kind of shield. And I would like to argue that as a biographer, it's possible to kind of ignore that shield and to start from scratch with somebody, or to take that shield, kind of lightly and explore other aspects of this person's life and motivations. And that one can do that without disrespecting the subject, and with that it's only normal that Jorge Simple be a human being and not a kind of stone hero. And in the reviews to my book, I think that I've seen, across the spectrum, some very enthusiastic reviews and some reviews that, seem to think that I had tarnished this hero or taken him down a notch. And that's, any life is very complex. And I think that, for example, if we'd been talking about Picasso, if I'd been writing a biographical piece on Picasso, nobody would expect me to, or at least I would hope that nobody would expect me to turn him into a moral hero, because he was not a moral hero. I mean, he was a fascinating artist and had a very interesting life. And I think both can be said about Jorge Simple too, who had a much more political life. But I think that his political goals were mixed with his own ambitions, his own desire for power, and that's absolutely normal and healthy. And so I think that, just some kind of words of advice for people dealing with, a difficult character, a subject who has a very set image in terms of their fame or celebrity, is that as a biographer, it's, you'll spend many years and many months working on this person and being with this person, and and you, while of course you would love to, have a great publishing contract and wonderful reviews, at the same time, you are going to know this person better than most people who may not even have read anything this person's written or seen one of their films or have any more than the most superficial image. So the important thing about a biography is that the biographer feel confident and comfortable in their intuitions about this person or subject that they have invested so much time into studying. So I would say go with those instincts, and there's no way to keep everybody happy, especially not the family, especially if we're dealing with somebody who's only seen as a one-dimensional hero to a lot of people. And anyway, it's a kind of a shortcut to saying something that could be more complex, but for now that will do. And I just wanted to end by saying that a lot of the people who I work on, their work is no longer in print, and that includes Jorge Simbroom and Constancia de la Mora and Maria Luisa Leo. Maria Luisa Leo, I have a book here of hers, Cuaderno de Apuntes, notebook. Sorry, it's kind of shiny and hard to see. But Maria Luisa Leo is a fascinating Spanish exile who ended up in Mexico. And I am bringing her best-known work, which is called Tiempo de Llorar, A Time to Cry, back into print with the Spanish publisher Renacimiento. I'm also bringing the work of Isabel Álvarez de Toledo, her book about being in a Spanish prison called My Prison, Mi Cárcel. Both of these works I'm doing biographical introductions for and also adding notes to them, and they should be coming out. I'd like to say I would have said in 2020, 2021. Now with the pandemic, this may be delayed, but I'm sure that they will be coming out within the next year or two. And I think Maria Luisa Leo's book, Tiempo de Llorar, I don't have it with me. It's in Barcelona, but I have Cuaderno de Apuntes. And very briefly, her family was an important Republican, and her family went into exile her father was an important Republican, and her family went into exile in France, and then through the kindness of a friend, their way was paid to go to Mexico by ship. And she had a very difficult exile. She was a teenager. Her parents went through great sadness. Her father had a really traumatic experience when the Civil War broke out, and in France he was in a concentration camp. And so when the family finally got to Mexico, I'd like to say, then everything was wonderful. They were reunited and they could live in freedom. But in fact, the exile was very sad for the parents, and their family really kind of fell apart. And Maria Luisa Leo was young enough that she was able to have an incredibly creative response to trauma and to exile. She studied acting, and she became a very well-known theater and film actress. She wrote the screenplay for a beautiful film about exile called El Balcón Vacío, the empty balcony. And she hung out with this incredibly interesting group of people that included artists like Leonora Carrington and authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude, is dedicated to Maria Luisa Leo and to her husband. She was really a kind of a muse for his work, and he said that almost every day when he would finish writing, he would call her up and read her everything that he had written during that day when he was writing 100 Years of Solitude. And she always said to him, I love it, and he, this is wonderful. And he was worried that the magical realism, that things would seem too fantastic or that they would be hard to believe. And she always told him, everything you're writing makes perfect sense to me, and I love it, and just keep going. And so that's, I think, how she earned the dedication of the novel, 100 Years of Solitude. And her work is very autobiographical, and the book that I'm re-editing, I don't have here, but I'm hoping that this very slim volume, which is just fragments of notebooks, may be a part of this. So it will be kind of a combined volume. And just to end, I would just like to read, actually, a couple of fragments from this fragment-like notebook, to show you how really beautiful and moving and inspiring her work is. And I'm just going to choose two short sections and read them in Spanish and then in English. I hope that's okay. And the good news is that with Maria Luisa Leo and Luisa Isabel Alvarez de Toledo, I am in touch with their family or the foundations that are in charge of their legacies. So these figures may be a little less elusive to me than Constancia de la Mora and Jorge Simbroom. I will have more materials and more cooperation. I'm in touch with Maria Luisa Leo's son, who is has an amazing publishing house in Mexico City. And in terms of exile and elusive lives and trauma and writing and life writing, I'd like to leave you with these two fragments from Maria Luisa Leo's work. The first one is very short, and these are fragments from the screenplay En el Balcón Vacío, which is about the Spanish Civil War and how it affected her as a child. So, the first fragment. En aquellos días en que ocurrió, aún era yo muy niña. ¿Qué diera yo por ser tan niña ahora, si es que acaso he dejado de serlo? Y entonces había algo en las calles, algo en las casas, que después desapareció con aquella guerra que aún veo por los tejados de las casas, aquella guerra que apareció un día en el grito de la mujer. Now I'm just going to do a kind of simultaneous translation, so please bear with me. In those days when it all happened, I was still a very young girl, what I wouldn't give to be so young now, if I actually ever stopped being that young. Then there was something in the streets, something in the homes, something that disappeared with that war that I can still see on the rooftops of the houses, that war that appeared one day in the form of a woman's scream. That's the first one, and now I'm going to read the second one, and I will close with this and look forward to your questions next week. It's incredible how time passes. How many times had I heard this phrase, and now I was there, and now it was there with me. Now I was the one saying, it's incredible how time passes. Why hadn't anybody told me really this thing about time? Why hadn't anybody put it in my hands and shown it to me? Look, little girl, this is time. Time is 10 fingers on which to count it. I'm 7 years old, 5 fingers from my right hand, 2 from my left hand. And afterwards, time is Christmas, next Christmas, and the Christmas after that. And after being time, it becomes a date. My saint's day, my birthday, and the day of my first communion. And after time becomes distance, 5 years after the war, 9 years after the war, 15 years after the war, and later there just isn't any more time left to count. There's only the time that passes, 6 years, 7 years, or a pleasant afternoon spent at home. I'm going to try to read this in Spanish, which I started in English, if this fits into my time of my video. Es increíble cómo pasa el tiempo. ¿Cuántas veces había oído decir esta frase? Y ahora estaba ahí, conmigo. Era yo quien la repetía. Es increíble cómo pasa el tiempo. ¿Por qué no me habían dicho antes lo que era el tiempo? ¿Por qué no me lo habíais puesto entre las manos y me lo habíais enseñado? Mira, niña, esto es el tiempo. El tiempo son 10 dedos para contarlo. Tengo 7 años, 5 de la mano derecha y 2 de la izquierda. Y después el tiempo es Navidades, la otra Navidad y la Navidad próxima. Y después deja de ser tiempo y se hace fecha, mi santo, mi cumpleaños y el día de mi primera comunión. Después el tiempo se hace distancia, 5 años después de la guerra, 9 años después de la guerra, 15 años después de la guerra. Y después ya no hay tiempo contado, solo hay tiempo que pasa, 6 años, 7 años, o una tarde agradable, pasada en casa. Thank you.